Hello, beautiful community. Let's say a little bit, or connect a little bit over the business of supporting Ukraine and Trump in the business of supporting Ukraine. Maybe we say a bit about the United States and Trump, and then a bit about Ukraine's perspective. Now, one feature of Trump voters is a feature of contemporary Western democracies, and that is that many citizens in them feel that their sense of political agency clashes with what they don't think is factual truth, but I do. So there's a conflict between the recognition of certain true facts and one's political identity. And that's not the fault of the individual. You can always talk to the individual at dinner about how they've ended up believing and supporting what they support. But at a political level, you have to recognize that there is a historical crisis of trust, and it's powered by certain social forces that are real. So this is not just people going around making epistemic mistakes because they're deliberative disasters, right? These are social forces out there at work, and at a political level, you've got to recognize that it's not that we've got a bunch of idiots here and there who are sort of, politically moronic. Not at all, right? That's an ethically disgraceful way to look upon fellow voters. What we've actually got is a society in which all too readily one's sense of political agency clashes with the recognition of certain facts. Now, this suggests what? Trump's enormous capacity to survive various kinds of processes and still win, get the nomination and then win. There is then something else, and that is the capacity of some people who vote for Trump to vote for Trump with a feeling of self-directed disgust, right? This is not a pure and clean enterprise for me, but I'm going to do it because it's a way of reacting against institutions and people in these institutions who are evil or who are traitors or have been taken over by some kind of malign foreign or global forces, and they're working against me now. So I'm going to give them a good kick. So that's not to say that I'm doing something about which I have a cause and effect account, which tells me how it'll benefit me. I don't have such an account, and I'm possibly engaged in magical thinking. So I'm not voting Trump because that's going to bring about these three consequences by those particular mechanisms. No. I'm acting beyond cause and effect, but I am acting to give a kick to a kind of institutional establishment that is either working against me or has disempowered me inexcusably, or has betrayed me, and or has become evil as a result of some kind of foreign takeover, globalist takeover, and so on. So that particular way of voting Trump, the self-disgust way of voting Trump, is very important when Trump goes up against Biden, right? So that kind of special tendency or pathology can make a lot of people instinctually vote Trump, even though they don't feel very good about doing so. So the reason I've put these couple of things on the table is just to give us the sense that a Trump victory, right, a Trump presidency, despite everything that's in the news now, is just a coin toss away, right? And if somebody said that Trump is the single most likely individual to be the next president of the United States, that itself would not be a remotely irrational statement. It's profoundly important, especially if you're an American citizen, to not condescend. Because condescending Trump voters is itself going to be a kind of a form of ignorance, a lack of political understanding, right? The very thing that one is trying to accuse these folks of. Partly because it might be that you don't get this business of agency versus facts and how the two clash. Partly it might be because you don't get this business of how we've all got to keep sitting at the table of politics to keep the show on the road, right? And toleration is an important value here. And toleration isn't kumbaya. Toleration is I don't like you, but we're going to keep sitting together at the table of politics. So there are plenty of illusions in the center and on the left that are also extraordinarily dominant and extraordinarily disfiguring of Western societies and their chances of democratic sustenance, right? So the amount of magical thinking in the center and on the left is also very high, right? It's very important to recognize that, especially when we're talking about this sort of incapacity to digest factual truth on the Trump side. Now let's say a bit about Ukraine. Big accounts on Twitter were saying the other day, pro-Ukrainian accounts, well, Trump's entrepreneurial, he'll just follow what the polls say, and the polls will say that Americans want to support Ukraine because that's how Americans feel, and they feel that more and more every day. Now, that's not my interpretation at all. I think that in the case of a Trump presidency, what will happen is uncertain, but the default expectation is a tapering down of resupply for Ukraine, followed by Western Europe doing the same. That's the default scenario. And I tweeted that yesterday, and at the end of that tweet I said Ukraine needs to prepare, and lovely Anna from Ukraine said, okay, well, prepare how? And let's try to say a couple of words about that. When I say prepare, I obviously don't mean something moral or spiritual. You could say something like that actually too, because how do you handle a situation where you've got to keep your country? You've got to keep it, you've got to try to make it whole, but the path to doing that isn't clear. You can't sit there and say, okay, to do that I've got to get from A to B to C to D. It's rather that I've got to get from A to C to A to B to C to and D is behind the clouds and you can't see it. You've got to work for it, but you can't see it. And that's a special kind of, right? Living through that is a tough requirement of maturity in a politically tragic world. But I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about politics. Now, politically, the Zelensky government is somewhat tied to the idea of a victorious war and a relatively short war. Relatively short means 1.5 years or 2 years, but not 6. And a victorious war means a war with a genuine prospect of making Ukraine whole again. A non-victorious war, given the massive support, right, that's come from the West, a non-victorious war is a war where Ukraine keeps its independence and maybe does a bit better than that, but that's all. And that's the position of the West. The position of the West, cumulatively speaking, is Ukraine stays independent and maybe does a bit better than that, but we're not supporting Ukraine up to the level of a victory, which means Ukraine can get a victory if there's a military collapse on Russia's part, mediated by morale, mediated by some kind of machinations within the regime in Moscow. There is, of course, another path for Ukraine to win, and that is if Russia, even though right now Russia doesn't want an escalation of the war, it wants to make the war low-level war that goes on and is escalated then later by the Kremlin. But if for some reason the Kremlin were to escalate now and do something very dramatic like use non-conventional weapons, that would regalvanize Western support. So that's another path, possible path to Ukrainian victory on top of Russian collapse. But these paths to victory are not commensurate with the West's primary strategy. There are things that happen over and above it or despite it. So certainly domestically, the Zelensky government would be looking for a kind of renegotiation if it looks like it looks now, that Ukraine may be heading toward a longer and less winnable war, right? And that may be that different things are expected of this government. Different questions, much tougher questions are asked of it. So that's a complex domestic challenge. And over and above that, right, there is just the basic question of setting expectations, right? What can we get out of the West and what can we not realistically, right? How long is this going to last? How long is it not going to last, right? Where are we with all of this? Are we waiting for the West to finally wake up and give us more and more rapidly over the next year? Or have we already reached the pinnacle of Western support? Where are we in this, right? Lucidity about that is really important. And the reality of wherever Western support is at, plus, if you like, domestic rhetoric, right, in Ukraine cannot drift too far apart from one another, right? And they're very different things. Building up a country into a fever pitch that may be sustainable for a year and a half, right, versus a 5-year war, right, which is a completely different type of political emotion that's required there. So these are my reflections for the moment. They are sober, but there are possibilities, and there are still possibilities for more support from the West in principle. But the trouble is that the limit that the Western support is running into is not so much a limit of hesitancy and reluctance as it is of a positive absence of a strategy for a Ukrainian victory. Now, what could change that, and is it realistic? Well, I don't think it's realistic, but I think one thing that could change it is a very clear picture of what you want to have happen on the ex-Soviet space. So that you're saying that's the outcome we want, and here's how we're going to go for it. Now, of course, that will still have to be calibrated against escalation management, nuclear escalation management, right? But if you had a clear picture of what you want to happen on the ex-Soviet space, then other issues that aren't about nuclear escalation management could be, to some extent, put away so they don't worry people anymore, such as, what if we get something much worse than Putin? Right. Well, given some of the analyses we have articulated, I don't think that that's a deep concern. And with some of the things we'll say in the next couple of episodes, when we look at the latest nuclear rhetoric from Russia, it's not even remotely plausible to argue that at least Putin is a safe nuclear actor and some nutcase who could take over from him wouldn't be. So that's enough for today, I think. Lots of love and talk soon. On the main channel, there will be a video hopefully in a few days. I had a health incident a few days ago, unfortunately, from which I'm still recovering. And that has delayed things. And that main channel itself needs a bit of medical intervention given the reduction of frequency of my posting. And I've noticed several people, quite a few people actually, been unsubscribed from it by YouTube. But I'm always exploring ways of growing this conversation. And my sense of where this conversation is heading is clear. And it's actually a much bigger and richer place than where we've got to yet. So I'm excited, and we'll talk soon.